The rustle of silk was the first sound to pierce the veil of sleep, a soft whisper that blended with the low murmur of guards beyond the door. Their voices were steady, almost mechanical. As if even conversation was a duty, their words carried through stone like a vibration rather than a meaning. The air in the small chamber was thick, sweet incense, rising from bronze burners, orange blossoms drifting in from the gardens below. To an outsider it would have smelled of wealth of sanctity, but to the little girl lying awake on her pallet, the 6-year-old Theodora, it smelled only of confinement. Her eyes opened slowly, meeting the dim mosaic floor, catching a faint shimmer from lamplight that hadn't been fully extinguished. Every detail around her carried the weight of someone else's ownership. The silk hangings, the tiled walls, even the faint song of caged birds in the courtyard, all of it belonged to the Greens, the Hippodrome faction that ruled this part of Constantinople's underbelly with the same authority as senators or generals. Her family lived here not because they had earned a place of their own, but because her father Acetius had given his life to beasts. He was a bear keeper, one of those men who fed and soothed the roaring creatures that filled the arena with spectacle. His body had been his currency, his loyalty his shield. But 3 days earlier, fever had taken him swift, merciless, leaving only a hollow absence that seemed louder than any roar of the Hippodrome. For Theodora, every waking moment since had been steeped in a cold dread, a stone lodged in her small chest. She could hear her mother in the outer chamber, muffled sobs breaking into dry silence. Her sisters, pressed together on their bedding, still slept fitfully. Only Theodora lay rigid, listening to the sounds of the faction complex stirring. A bucket clattering on stone, a beast roaring answered by the lash of a trainer's whip. Shouts of me preparing for another day's entertainment. Life surged on, utterly indifferent to the collapse of hers. The irony of their surroundings was cruel. Visitors might believe the family-privileged mosaic floors, manicured gardens, silks fluttering in the hallways. But Theodora already knew in the instinctive way children sense truths adults refuse to name that these luxuries were never theirs. They were loans, conditional favours, the gilding of a cage. Her father had provided the service. The family had been tolerated. Now with him gone, the debt had come due. The Hippodrome factions were not mere sports clubs. They were organisms, half political machine, half criminal syndicate, bound together by colour and loyalty. The Greens, to whom Theodora's family belonged, held their fortunes through patrons and performers, their influence stretching from the palace gates to the slums. They provided bread, shelter, sometimes even protection. But nothing was free. Every gift could be revoked. Every favour carried a hidden ledger. In Constantinople, to fall out of a faction's grace was to step into the streets naked to the teeth of the city. Theodora pulled her thin blanket closer, though it gave little warmth. She was too young to name the fear, but she felt it like a storm building on the horizon, an inevitability. She imagined the street outside the complex, merchants shouting, gamblers, brawling beggars, pressing dirty hands toward passers-by. She had seen the feral dogs fight for scraps near the cistern. She understood dimly, but enough that this would soon be her family's fate. The palace gardens were just beyond the walls, fragrant with orange blossoms and shaped by wealth into order. But beyond the faction compound's gates lay a different Constantinople, raw, teeming, merciless. From the inner room, her mother's movements grew sharper, frantic. There was the rustle of fabric pulled from chests, the hiss of whispered instructions to her sisters. Her mother's grief had not numbed her. It had transformed into a desperate energy. She began to lay out their finest garments, faction-coloured tunics that had long since faded and frayed. They were costumes of belonging, threadbare declarations that this family still mattered to someone. Each patch sewn into those tunics carried a memory of survival. A coin earned a patron placated, a hunger staved. Now they would be armour for a ritual of pleading. Theodora sat up, heart hammering. She watched her sisters be dressed, their pale faces stiff with confusion. When her mother fastened the buttons at the back of her own tunic, the woman's fingers trembled cold against the girl's warm skin. It was not the gentle touch she remembered, but hurried desperate, as though every second stolen from preparation would tip them closer to ruin. Outside the chorus of Constantinople swelled the tramp of soldiers on the meze, the hawkers calling wares in Greek and Latin, the distant ringing of church bells overlaid with the sharper blare of horns from the palace precinct. To most citizens it was the sound of the city's greatness. To Theodora it was the sound of indifference, a city too vast to care that a child was about to lose not just a father, but the fragile scaffolding of safety he had provided. That morning, as sunlight slipped through lattice windows and caught on dust motes, the weight of opulence pressed down on her like a cruel joke. The silks and mosaics were not gifts. They were reminders you are tolerated because you are useful, and when usefulness ends, so does tolerance. At 6 years old, Theodora had learned a truth that would burn in her memory for life. Wealth without power is debt, and debt always comes due. Hey there! Before we go on, tap like and subscribe if these stories make you pause, reflect, or smile. And now tell me, where in the world are you joining me from tonight, and what hour has history found you at? I want to hear your story. The air in the corridor was cool and sharp, the marble beneath their bare feet polished to a mirror's sheen. Theodora's mother walked first, her grip iron on her daughter's hands, her face fixed in a mask of desperate composure. The girls' tunics, though once fine, now betrayed the truth of their situation. Faded colours, seams patched too many times, threads unravelling at the edges. Theodora felt as though they were not walking towards salvation, but being led to a ritual sacrifice. At the end of the hall, sunlight poured through arched windows illuminating the great chamber where the Green's patrons waited. Men reclined on low couches draped with silks, their bodies heavy with luxury, their fingers glittering with rings. The scent of spiced wine and roasted meat hung in the air, clashing with the cloying incense that followed Theodora's family like a shroud. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of light golden flecks that mocked the heavy gloom pressing on her chest. Theodora's mother stepped forward, shoulders bent under the invisible weight of need. When she spoke, her voice cracked in the vast room, fragile and raw. She told them of Acacius, her husband, the bear keeper, who had served them loyally for years, who had calmed savage animals, so their games might thrill the crowd who had died too quickly, leaving his family with nothing. She begged not for charity, but for continuity, that his wage be extended, that another man, perhaps a cousin, might take his place. A plea for bread, not luxury, for survival, not favour. But the men did not hear, or rather they chose not to. One leaned back, studying the nails of his hand as though they were more fascinating than the widow's words. Another swirled his cup, watching the crimson liquid rise and fall, his eyes drifting across the children as if they were furniture. Theodora, clutching the folds of her tunic, felt their gazes pass over her with all the warmth of a knife's edge. The Greens had long been more than entertainers. In Constantinople, the factions were shadow governments, lords of entire neighbourhoods with coffers filled by betting bribes and imperial stipends. They employed thousands charioteers, animal trainers, musicians, guards, even hired mobs. The wealth they displayed was not personal extravagance. It was power made visible, meant to remind every supplicant who held life and death in the city. To them, Theodora's family was not kin or community. They were an entry in an account book, one asset struck off the ledger when it ceased to produce profit. And for a woman, the calculus of mercy was harsher still. In the gendered hierarchy of the empire, widows without dowries or patrons were liabilities. A man might have been offered another role, a boy apprenticeship, a girl nothing. Women begged with lowered eyes, their dignity surrendered as currency. Theodora's mother's trembling words were in their ears little more than noise and inconvenience interrupting the comfort of their cushions. Her plea faltered. Her voice thinned into silence, broken only by the scratch of a scribe's stylus in the corner, recording some matter of real importance. At last, one of the faction leaders, a man with neatly trimmed beard rings flashing as he gestured, made the smallest of motions. A flick of the wrist, casual and final. It carried no sound, no explanation, but its meaning was absolute. The guard stepped forward, not to guide them gently, but to shove them toward the doors. Theodora stumbled, her hand yanked painfully as her mother tried to steady her. Laughter followed them out, sharp and cruel, echoing against the marble. It was not the laughter of joy, but of dismissal, the sound of men who had just reminded a grieving woman of her worth nothing. The sun outside struck them with blinding force. The brilliant light turned their patched tunics into grotesque parodies of finery, the dust of the street rising immediately to cling to the cloth. Her mother stood frozen for a moment, the tears cutting pale streaks down her cheeks. Her shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. And then, with a sudden steel born of desperation, she tightened her grip on her daughter's hands. Her gaze turned across the avenue to the rival compound of the Blues. If the Greens had abandoned them, perhaps their enemies would see value where their patrons had seen only nuisance. Theodora glanced back once at the high windows of the hall they had just left. She imagined the laughter still floating in the air, gilded and cruel, staining the very stones. It was the first lesson carved into her young soul in a city where power was spectacle and mercy, a calculation dignity was the cheapest currency, and children were taught its price before they even knew the word. The march across Constantinople's avenue was short in distance but vast in meaning. Theodora's mother pulled her daughters through the press of bodies, hawkers shouting their wares, beggars crouched in the dust, the iron-shod hooves of horses clattering against stone. The sun was merciless, baking the limestone walls until they seemed to glow with heat, but the heat was nothing compared to the shame still clinging to them like a second skin. Behind them lingered the echo of laughter from the Greens Hall. Ahead rose the rival compound of the Blues, its gates painted in the deep colour of the sea at dusk. The Blues were not merely another circus team. In Constantinople, the colours were entire nations within the city. The Greens drew their base from merchants, artisans, and the poorer wards. The Blues from wealthier landowners, imperial officials, and the palace itself. Each faction commanded loyalty that went beyond sport. They ran charities, brokered deals, policed neighbourhoods, and when it suited them, unleashed gangs of supporters who could turn the streets into battlefields. In a city where church and state struggled for supremacy, the factions were the third pillar, equal parts mob, corporation, and militia. To approach the Blues was not to ask for help. It was to negotiate a contract. The guards at the entrance, clad in tunics dyed a clear-cutting blue, looked at Theodora's family with an expression different from the Greens' bored disdain. Their eyes were sharp, calculating, as if weighing value against risk. Yet they did not turn them away. With a nod, the family was ushered through cool corridors into a smaller, darker chamber. Inside there were no reclining couches, no display of lazy opulence. A single heavy table dominated the room, covered in scrolls, wax tablets, and coins laid out in tidy stacks. Behind it sat the Blues' leader, a man whose reputation had reached even Theodora's young ears. His fingers were encased in rings, each one glinting like a promise or a threat, but his eyes were colder still. They were the colour of a winter sea, and they fixed on Theodora as if she were already property. Her mother began her plea again, voice-ragged words tumbling out in broken rhythm. She spoke of a caexius of service and loyalty of daughters too young to fend for themselves. But here the words sounded different. This was not a hall of petition, it was a counting house. Every syllable was a ledger entry, every tear a calculation. The man did not interrupt. He simply looked long and deliberate, not at the widow's bowed head, but at the child who stood slightly apart. His gaze on Theodora was not warm nor cruel, but clinical, like a merchant assessing livestock. She felt it crawl across her skin, and even at 6 she understood this was not about compassion. It was about potential. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the scratch of a scribe's stylus in the corner. At last the leader gave a single slow nod. His words were flat, delivered as if dictating terms of trade. The Blues would take them in. Food, shelter, protection, these would be granted. But in return there would be no end to obligation. Their survival would not be a gift. It would be a debt one to be paid not in coin, but in lifelong service, in loyalty that could never be rescinded. A sound escaped Theodora's mother, half sob and half prayer. Relief broke across her features, raw and radiant. To her this was salvation. To Theodora, staring at the man's cold hands and the scribe's silent record, it was the closing of another cage door. In the years to come, the lines between Blues and Greens would blur into the greater politics of the empire itself. Their colours would march not only in the hippodrome, but in riots, in church councils, even in the throne room. To survive inside their walls was to be drawn into the bloodstream of Byzantine power, one drop at a time until there was no escape. Theodora could not know it yet, but she had already stepped onto the same stage that would one day carry her into history. The courtyard behind the Blues compound was no school, yet it served as one. Its floor was bare sand, scattered with shards of pottery and wood, and the walls scarred from years of rough use. Theodora's classroom was not lined with scrolls, but with sweating bodies and shouted commands. She was still a child, yet her body was already being honed into an instrument that could feed a family and repay a debt that seemed infinite. The training began with the voice. In a world where the roar of a crowd could drown out steel striking stone, a performer's survival depended on projection. Theodora was forced to stand in the centre of the yard, her thin frame dwarfed by the expanse of sand and crylines to the furthest wall until her throat burned. Trainers corrected her constantly, too shrill, too soft, too fast. She learned to shape her breath like a weapon, so a whisper could travel to the first row and a shout could slice through the deafening roar of 30,000. Then came the body. Acrobatics were demanded not for grace but for spectacle. Theodora practiced backflips until her stomach churned splits, until her muscles screamed, and balances on one hand until her arms trembled like reeds in the wind. A slip meant bruises. Repeated failure meant harsher correction. She grew calluses on her palms, scabs on her knees, strength in her shoulders. The dust worked its way into her skin until she carried the hippodrome in every pore. More subtle still was mimicry. In the evenings, older performers gathered them, close teaching with sly humour. They imitated senators' pompous waddles, generals' chest-thrusting strides, bishops' sanctimonious tones. Theodora learned quickly, memorising the small gestures of power, the finger tapping a jewelled ring, the tilt of the head that suggested superiority. In the safety of the yard, such mimicry was comedy. In the hippodrome, it was sharper satire that mapped the anatomy of authority, giving the mob permission to laugh at the men who ruled their lives. But the most brutal lesson was the economy of emotion. Applause was not guaranteed. It had to be earned, extracted, coaxed. Trainers showed her how to summon tears at will, not from sorrow but from calculation. A single tear could soften a restless crowd, pulling coin from pockets faster than any joke. A turned back, if timed perfectly, could stir outrage that made the audience lean forward, desperate for reconciliation. Emotion became currency and the stage a marketplace. Theodora discovered quickly that crowds were like weather. They could be read a murmur spreading like a dark cloud before rain laughter, rolling in waves like distant thunder. She learned when to ride the noise and when to cut across it, when to provoke and when to soothe. One moment of misjudgment could turn adoration into violence, rotten fruit hurled jeers, rising sometimes stones. But if she caught the mood just right, the same mob could lift her name into something like worship. By 10 years old, she was less a child than a creature of spectacle, a girl whose survival was yoked to the fickle appetite of the hippodrome. Each lesson left its scar visible or invisible, but also forged a resilience that no ordinary upbringing could give. The arena was cruel, but it was also a forge, and Theodora was being hammered into a weapon that could command thousands. She did not yet understand that these lessons, projection, mimicry, timing, were not just for the stage. They were rehearsals for power itself. By 16, Theodora could hold a crowd in her hands as easily as a juggler held torches. She had grown tall and wiry, her body hardened by years of acrobatics, her voice seasoned by 1,000 rehearsals in the dust and heat. When she stepped onto the hippodrome stage, the mob roared, as if an emperor himself had entered. The torches flared, drums thundered, and for a few blinding moments she was no longer the bearkeeper's orphan, or the blues' indentured servant. She was a star. Her beauty was sharp, almost defiant. High cheekbones dusted with gold eyes, rimmed with kohl, that could flash with mischief one instant and freeze into disdain the next. Her voice could carry laughter into the rafters, or pull the lowest groan of sorrow from a packed arena. She had learned to make every gesture precise, the tilt of her chin that invited adoration, the pause in her step that teased suspense, the sudden break into tears that sent the crowd into a frenzy. The hippodrome answered her with thunder, stomping feet rattling coin shouts of her name until the very stones seemed to tremble. And yet beneath the roar, contempt hummed like a second note. For every cheer there was the leering gaze of a wealthy patron in the front rows. For every bouquet tossed a hand brushing her arm in the corridors afterward as though she were merchandise. In Byzantium's cultural lexicon, an actress was admired, even adored, but never respected. The line between performer and prostitute was wafer-thin blurred, not just by rumour but by law. Women who took the stage were marked as public property, their bodies presumed accessible, their dignity constantly negotiated. Late Roman and Byzantine performance culture thrived on this contradiction. The city that filled its churches with mosaics of saints also filled its nights with bawdy comedies, mimed satires, and acrobatic shows. The people craved spectacle as much as sanctity, sometimes in the same breath. The hippodrome was not only a place of chariot races and imperial rituals, it was a marketplace of desire, where beauty could be monetized as easily as bread. Theodora had become one of its brightest commodities. She felt the contradiction most acutely in the silks she wore. Under torchlight they shimmered, making her appear ethereal, untouchable. But once the curtain fell, the same silks felt like costumes for a play she had never chosen. The applause that had just washed over her with the force of a tide rang hollow when she caught the smirks of men who believed they had purchased a piece of her by tossing coins at her feet. Each night ended not in triumph but in retreat, slipping away from the stage lights into corridors where value was tallied and her humanity discounted. Theodora's name became a tavern word shouted over cups of wine, whispered with envy by women desired and dismissed by men. She was in the eyes of the city both elevated and degraded, a creature who could command the mob's love yet never escape its ownership. She carried herself like a queen on stage, but off it she knew she was still in a cage, its bars made not of iron but of reputation. That knowledge festered. She had clawed her way into stardom, but even at her highest she could see the ceiling pressing down. Fame was a currency, but it was transient, spent quickly, and always leaving her poorer than before. Theodora began to hunger for something beyond the roar of the hippodrome, a place where her voice would not be reduced to entertainment, where her mind could matter as much as her beauty. The crowd gave her bread and fleeting glory, but it could not give her freedom. The cage glittered more brightly now, but it was still a cage, and deep within her, the desire to break it had already begun to burn. He was not the first man to approach her after a performance, but he was the first who did not come with wine-thick breath, or coins clinking in his hand. Hercubalus, governor of Pentapolis in Roman Libya, carried himself with the stiff posture of authority, his bearing carved by office rather than indolence. He had watched Theodora's performances not with the lazy hunger of a patron, but with a steady evaluating gaze. When he finally asked to speak with her, it was not amid the chaos of admirers clawing for her attention, but in a quiet, calculated moment when the torches had burned low and the stage was silent. His offer was startling in its plainness, not a purse for a night, but a place in his household. Not secrecy, but acknowledgement. He would take her with him to Pentapolis, not as a slave or an ornament, but as his companion, his consort in all but law. It was not love he offered, and Theodora was too shrewd to mistake it for such. What he extended was a kind of legitimacy, a step out of the humiliating limbo between star and commodity. The promise gleamed like a key in a lock she had never been allowed to open. She could leave behind the dust of the hippodrome, the mockery, the casual ownership of patrons. To walk beside a governor was to be treated differently, at least in public. It was a reprieve, perhaps even a rebirth. And so with a heart pounding not from fear but from reckless hope she accepted. The voyage south was both ordeal and revelation. The ship was a sturdy merchant vessel, its decks crowded with barrels of oil and amphorae of wine destined for African ports. Theodora stood at the rail, the wind tugging her hair, watching the horizon roll and shift. The air was salt-scoured, stripped of incense and smoke raw and foreign. At night she lay awake, listening to the creak of timbers and the slap of waves, each sound carrying her farther from the life she had known. When they reached Pentapolis, the land rose ochre and green under a blinding sky. The provincial capital was smaller than Constantinople, less dazzling, but the sun-baked courtyards, the olive groves stretching to the horizon, and the echo of prayers from desert monasteries gave it a character all its own. Here Theodora discovered the fragile glow of respect. Servants bowed, addressed her with titles, offered her cushions and shade. She dined in open-air halls where the stars burned closer and sharper than in the smoky sky of the hippodrome. For the first time in her life she felt the possibility of being something more than a diversion. But respect in the empire was a moving target. In the world of Roman administration, governors came and went like tides. They were recalled, promoted, or disgraced on the whim of distant courts. Pentapolis itself was a crossroads, its wealth drawn from trade routes that connected Africa, the Mediterranean, and the desert interior. The city was alive with competing tongues, Greek, Latin, Berber, dialects, its politics no less fractious than Constantinople's. Here a woman's dignity could rise with her patron's fortunes and vanish just as swiftly. Theodora must have sensed the fragility of her new position, even in the glow of deference. The cushions were softer, the food richer, the glances more careful, but the foundation was the same borrowed authority, conditional and temporary. She had stepped into a brighter cage, one whose bars were polished by the desert sun. Still, for a fleeting season, she allowed herself to believe the walls might not close in, that perhaps under this sky she could reinvent herself at last. It ended as suddenly as it had begun. A message arrived from Constantinople, sealed with authority. Terse and irrefutable Hecebulus was recalled. His tenure in Pentapolis was over. His usefulness shifted elsewhere by men he would never see. Theodora watched the change come over his face, the tightening of his jaw, the efficient flick of his hand summoning servants. The cushions she had once sat upon were stripped, the silks packed away. All the small courtesies that had lent her dignity dissolved into silence. She was not part of the order, not part of the household, not even part of the departure. By the time they reached Alexandria's harbour, the decision had already been made. She would not sail with him. The dock sprawled in chaos, a living artery that fed the empire. Grain fleets from the Nile crowded the wharves, their hulls heavy with the bread that kept Constantinople alive. Galleys creaked against their mooring sails, snapping in the sea wind. Dockworkers shouted in Greek, Latin and Coptic, their voices clashing with the bray of donkeys and the cries of fishmongers hawking the morning's catch. The smell was a potent assault, tar salt, sweat, fish and spice mingling, until the air itself felt thick with commerce. Hecebulus gave her nothing. No coin pressed into her hand, no explanation, not even the courtesy of a lie. He simply walked the gangplank, his figure swallowed into the machinery of his ship as easily as a grain sack hoisted aboard. Ropes were cast off, sails unfurled, and the vessel moved into the glittering sea. Theodora stood on the sun-bleached planks, abandoned. The sun bore down like a punishment reflecting off whitewashed walls, until the city itself seemed to blaze. Theodora's fine silks, once a badge of borrowed status, now clung heavy and out of place, marking her as foreign exposed. Around her surged the teeming life of Alexandria porters, straining under amphory sailors bellowing orders, merchants beckoning in half a dozen tongues. Here no one knew her name. Here she was only another figure adrift, stripped of ties, without coin or protector. Survival for a woman alone in such a city was not philosophy, but mechanics. Which baker might spare stale bread at closing? Which stall left its fruit unguarded? Which alley offered shadow without drawing the attention of men who watched too closely? She learned the answers quickly, moving through the labyrinth of colonnades and markets with lowered eyes, her once proud posture bent by hunger. The hippodrome had taught her how to read a crowd, now she learned how to disappear inside one. Alexandria was a city of layers. Greek philosophers argued in shaded porticos, while desert monks whispered prayers in hidden chapels. Jewish merchants tallied ledgers beside Roman soldiers, drinking wine by the jug. Languages mingled like tides washing over Theodora in sounds she barely grasped. It was a place where anyone might belong, but belonging had to be purchased, and she had no currency left but her wits. She wandered those streets hollow with loss, the applause of Constantinople replaced by the gnawing ache of hunger. Each day became a performance of a different kind, the art of invisibility, the calculated act of appearing too insignificant to notice. In the shadow of one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, Theodora was reduced to her most fragile form, a girl alone learning survival, one crust of bread, one night of uneasy shelter at a time. Hunger led her steps more surely than faith. Days of wandering. Alexandria's labyrinth brought Theodora bent and hollow-eyed to a small chapel tucked behind a row of colonnades. It was no grand basilica. Its plaster walls were cracked, its lamps smoky, its benches rough-hewn. Yet within the air was cooler, the noise of the market softened, and the scent of bread and sour wine lingered. She slipped inside, not as a believer, but as a beggar. There the Monophysites gathered. To the imperial church they were heretics, those who rejected the Council of Chalcedon's decree that Christ had two natures, divine and human, inseparably joined. Instead, they proclaimed one united divine nature. To theologians the difference was vast, a matter of councils, anathemas, and imperial decrees. To the poor it was simpler. The Monophysites spoke of a Christ who suffered as they suffered, who was cast out and despised, who understood abandonment. It was a theology of the margins, and it resonated with the displaced. Theodora accepted the bread they offered with trembling hands. She drank the thin wine not in reverence, but in survival. Yet as she sat in the dimness, the patriarch's voice carried through the chapel, rich and sonorous. He spoke of a faith persecuted by the state of believers who endured exile and scorn yet remained steadfast. He spoke of a Christ who did not dwell in gilded cathedrals but walked with beggars and widows. For the first time, Theodora felt words cutting through her hunger to something deeper. Her conversion was not gentle, not the soft flowering of piety. It was ruthless, lucid, a realignment of purpose. The Monophysites gave her more than bread. They gave her a story she could inhabit, one that reframed her survival as destiny rather than shame. She began to serve in the chapel, carrying messages, copying letters, listening, as patriarchs whispered strategies in back rooms. In return, she absorbed not just theology but politics. She saw how doctrine swayed emperors, how bishops leveraged scripture into power, how dissident communities built networks of protection that rivaled those of the circus factions. For Theodora, it was a second apprenticeship. Where the Hippodrome had taught her to read crowds, the Monophysites taught her to read ambition cloaked in holiness. She learned to listen for the difference between conviction and convenience, to file away names and grievances, to see how faith could be weaponized as effectively as satire. The humility she performed, now bowed head, rough tunic hands busy at the spindle, was as deliberate as any role she had ever played. In that crucible of hunger and heresy, Theodora was remade. She was no longer merely an abandoned actress surviving on scraps. She was a woman with a framework, a voice that spoke of suffering, but also of strength, and a network that promised protection if she remained useful. Her body, once her only currency, was joined by something more dangerous, a sharpened intellect fueled by rage clothed in piety. The Hippodrome had taught her spectacle. The Monophysites taught her patience. Together they became the foundation of a new identity, one that would carry her back across the sea and into the heart of empire. The ship that bore her back to Constantinople was no governor's galley. This time no proud vessel crewed by servants who bowed in deference. It was a merchant cog, squat and practical, its hull packed tight with grain sacks and clay amphorae of oil. The timbers creaked under the weight and the decks smelled of pitch, salt and mildew. Yet to Theodora, standing at the rail as the sea wind whipped her hair, the voyage felt less like exile than baptism. Each spray of salt water across her face washed away another layer of the girl who had once danced for coins. She was returning to the city not as an abandoned mistress nor as a beggar, but as something altogether harder remade by hunger, sharpened by faith, armoured by purpose. When the Golden Horn opened before her, the sight was almost unbearable in its familiarity. The domes of Constantinople gleamed in the afternoon sun, their tiles like scales of a dragon sprawling across the hills. Masts clustered at the harbours like a forest of stripped trees. The air carried 1,000 voices, Greek merchants bargaining, Latin clerics chanting, Syriac sailors shouting orders, slaves groaning under loads. To most travellers it was chaos. To Theodora it was home and battlefield. She did not return to the Blues compound nor seek refuge among old acquaintances who might remember her on the stage. Instead, with coins carefully hoarded from her service in Alexandria, she secured a single narrow room in a modest house on a steep street that climbed toward the palace. Its whitewashed walls were bare, its only window opening to a sliver of sky where if she leaned just right she could glimpse the imperial domes and the snapping banners above. That glimpse was deliberate. Every morning when she sat at her spindle she could see power itself glittering just beyond reach. The spindle became her instrument of disguise. From dawn until the bells of midday she worked the wool with rough repetitive motions, her palms blistering, her back stooped. To passers-by, senators carried in litters, guards marching to change the watch, scribes bustling with scrolls. She was nothing more than a penitent woman humbly remaking her life through honest labour. To curious neighbours she was a tale of redemption. The actress turned devout spinner, a woman who had renounced sin for virtue. It was a performance as exact as any she had given on stage, but subtler, deadlier. What others did not see was how stillness became her weapon. From her low seat by the window she observed everything. The rhythm of the guard rotations, how the palace gates clanged shut at sunset, how fresh watchmen replaced the weary ones at dawn. The comings and goings of officials which senator favoured, which route home, which priest lingered too long at a tavern before entering the palace chapel. She learned the very heartbeat of the city. Each change of hoofbeats or shout in the street added to her silent archive. Like a spider at the edge of a web, she did not move, but she felt every vibration. Each thread of information added to the structure she was weaving, invisible yet real. Her humility was a mask, her piety a shield. Beneath it all burned a certainty she had placed herself in the shadow of power, and power would notice her soon enough. She heard the approach before she saw it, the steady, measured rhythm of footsteps that carried authority in every strike against the stones. Not the shuffle of servants or the swagger of faction men, but the tread of guards, the murmur of advisers, the faint jingle of harness, buckles polished to mirror brightness. A shadow fell across her threshold, darkening the patch of sun where her spindle turned. Theodora lifted her head, and for the first time her eyes met Justinian's. He was not yet emperor, but power seemed to move with him like a cloak. Nephew to the reigning Justin, he had already earned a reputation in the capital. Severe, tireless, a man who breathed statutes as other men breathed air. His face was angular, his brow furrowed from long hours bent over legal codes, his eyes sharp and cold as iron nails. He was known to rise before dawn to dictate laws and retire only when exhaustion forced him, his life consumed not by spectacle or revelry but by the endless machinery of governance. Law was his oxygen order, his faith. Most who crossed his path dropped their eyes or bent their backs in shallow bows, but Theodora did neither. She straightened slightly, her hand stilling on the spindle, and held his gaze. Not bold, not coy, merely steady, refusing the script expected of her. The silence stretched taut and electric. Justinian paused, unused to being looked at without fear or flattery. When she finally saw, her voice was low, but carried with a clarity trained in the hippodrome. She did not plead or praise. She offered an argument. She referenced a recent edict debated in the Senate, one concerning property rights. With crisp precision, she laid out how its provisions, though tidy on parchment, would create loopholes exploited by the wealthy, and crush those without influence. She spoke of unintended consequences of the reality beneath legal abstraction of the way lives bent beneath rules crafted by men who never walked the streets. Justinian stood still, his expression unreadable, though his eyes had sharpened into an intensity that silenced the advisers hovering just behind him. He had built his life on the conviction that law could shape the empire as stone shaped a dome, perfect, enduring, rational. Yet here was a woman plainly dressed, unafraid to meet his gaze, cutting into his carefully tended edifice with the knife of lived truth. He listened, not as a noble tolerating diversion, but as a jurist confronting an equal. Her words were not ornament, but argument, and she delivered them without hesitation, weaving logic as deftly as she once spun wool. It was the first conversation in which Theodora revealed the depth beneath the mask of humility, and the first time Justinian glimpsed in her not just beauty, but a mind as restless and exacting as his own. The streets seemed to vanish around them, the guards, the spindle, the clamour of Constantinople's heart fading into silence. Two minds tethered by intellect and will met in that charged instant. For Justinian, accustomed to sycophants and flatterers, it was like cold water across his face, bracing, undeniable. For Theodora, it was recognition, the sense that her waiting, her watching, her careful stillness had drawn power itself into her web. Neither looked away, and in that refusal the course of an empire began to shift. The problem was older than either of them. Since the age of Augustus, Roman law had carried a stain clause, a prohibition written into its moral codes. No man of senatorial rank could marry an actress, a dancer, or a prostitute. The law treated performance as pollution, branding women of the stage as unfit for legitimate union. Their bodies might stir applause, but their names could never be joined to patrician bloodlines. It was a barrier designed to guard the dignity of Rome itself, or so the jurists claimed. In truth, it was a cage designed to ensure that women who had once been seen by the public could never rise into its ruling class. For Justinian, it was an absurdity. He had already been drawn inexorably into Theodora's gravity. Her intellect matched his own, her will refused to bow, and her vision seemed to echo his obsession with order. To him, the Augustan law was not just outdated, it was intolerable. What Rome had declared impossible, he would make possible. And he would do it not with flowers or songs, but with statutes and seals. In the halls of the palace, scrolls were unfurled across marble tables. Jurists bent over them with styluses in hand, hunting for contradictions in centuries of accumulated law. Roman jurisprudence, for all its grandeur, was a living organism, a body of decrees, rescripts, and precedents endlessly amended to suit the needs of emperors. Justinian understood this better than anyone. Law was not a cage, it was clay. It could be reshaped so long as one had the will and the authority. His strategy was surgical. He did not challenge the old ban head-on as if he were pleading for indulgence. Instead, he isolated it as an anomaly, an archaic moral clause, out of step with the empire's broader commitment to imperial discretion. He argued that the emperor had always possessed the supreme right to regulate social order in the state's interest. If an emperor could elevate a slave to office or legitimize an illegitimate child, why should a marriage be bound by a dusty edict from 5 centuries past? Behind closed doors, Justinian pressed his case to the one man whose hand could sanctify it, his uncle Emperor Justin. The old ruler was aging weary, increasingly dependent on his brilliant nephew to govern the empire's affairs. In the incense-thick chambers of the palace, Justinian spoke of stability of legitimacy, of the strength that would come from uniting with a woman of the people. He spoke of Theodora's piety, her redemption, her proven virtue. He painted her not as a threat, but as a symbol, a bridge between court and commoner. The emperor listened, his hand trembling slightly as he signed. With a stroke of reed on parchment, the old law was demolished. The edict was proclaimed across the city, and 525 actresses could now marry men of senatorial rank. More startling still, the proclamation bore no distant impersonal title. It was known by a name whispered in the forums carved into memory, with a scandalous intimacy. They called it the Law of Theodora. It was more than a permission slip, it was precedent. Roman law had long been a monument of stone, but Justinian showed that it could bend when power required it. By attaching her name, the decree branded Theodora into the legal fabric of the empire. Her identity, once a mark of shame, had been transmuted into statute. A girl who once wept in faction silks was now a clause in Rome's code. For Theodora it was intoxicating. Not the flattery of a lover or the applause of a mob, but the first true taste of structural power, the kind that rewrites rules rather than obeys them. The door to the throne, once barred by prejudice older than memory, now stood open, its hinges loosened by ink, will, and obsession. The air inside the Church of the Holy Apostles was thick enough to choke on. Incense coiled upward in blue-grey ribbons, mixing with the heavy sweetness of beeswax candles. Sunlight slanted through jewel-bright mosaics, scattering fractured colours across marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen. At the centre of this orchestrated blaze of light and smoke stood Theodora, her body rigid with poise, her face smoothed into an expressionless mask. The ceremony unfolded with measured grandeur. Priests chanted in resonant cadences that reverberated off the vaulted ceilings. The chrism oil was dabbed onto her forehead, its scent sharp and sanctified at a visible marker that even heaven's authority was being invoked to crown her. When the patriarch lifted the diadem, pearl-heavy, crusted with gems, the weight of empires condensed into gold, the congregation stirred. Every eye fixed upon her as the crown descended, as if witnessing a crime committed in daylight. Theodora felt the physical weight press against her brow heavier than any jewel. Yet heavier still was the invisible weight of contempt. The senators standing in their silken ranks, the aristocratic women with their jewelled veils, the generals stiff with medals, all of them looked at her with the naked hostility of a class forced to watch its fortress breached. They saw not an Augusta, but an interloper, the daughter of a bear-keeper, the actress who had dared to stride onto their sacred stage. Their eyes were daggers, and she felt each one pierce her skin, but she did not flinch. Years on the hippodrome stage had taught her how to stand before tens of thousands, how to accept their adoration and their hatred in equal measure. Performance was her armour. She drew herself taller, chin-lifted shoulders square, the diadem glittering like a halo in the fractured sunlight. Her face became serenity itself, a mask smoother than ivory, betraying nothing of the thunderous triumph hammering in her chest. Court ritual was not decoration, it was machinery. Every bow, every chant, every flicker of light was designed to manufacture legitimacy. An actress knew better than anyone how costumes and staging created belief, and so Theodora played her role with absolute mastery. To the aristocracy, her presence was a scandal. To the city watching beyond those walls, it was a spectacle sanctified by ritual, a performance so complete it transmuted into reality. As the choir's thunderous hymn rolled through the church, Theodora allowed her eyes to drift across the sea of hostile faces. They could hate her, dismiss her, curse her. It did not matter. She had endured laughter in the halls of the Greens, hunger in the streets of Alexandria, exile on docks that smelled of fish and salt. Now she stood crowned Augusta of Rome not by their permission, but by law, by ritual, by sheer unyielding will. Beneath the mask, her heart beat furiously, but no one would ever see it. They would see only the woman who wore the crown without trembling, They would see a sovereign, and for Theodora that was victory enough. The city was burning. From the high windows of the great palace, the horizon glowed red smoke rising in plumes that blotted out the winter sky. The roar outside was not the familiar thunder of the hippodrome crowd, but something deeper, uglier. The unified howl of blues and greens turned against the throne itself. Torches bobbed in the streets like malevolent fireflies. Stones hammered against the bronze gates until the metal groaned. Inside, the air was thick with incense hastily lit as if smoke from censers could counterbalance the stench of fear. It was January 502 and Constantinople was in revolt. What began as a protest over a botched execution had spiraled into the Nika riots, an inferno that consumed the city. The factions that had once defined Theodora's entire childhood rivals who would kill each other for the honour of a colour were now united in their venom for her and for Justinian. They chanted one word over and over, Nika conquer. But it was not his armies they wanted to conquer. It was him. Inside the palace, chaos mirrored the streets. Senators and courtiers crowded the imperial chamber, their silk robes dishevelled, their voices shrill with terror. Advisers pleaded with Justinian to flee. The royal barges were ready at the sea walls, they insisted. A quick escape across the Bosporus, a retreat to safer provinces, was their only chance. Their words poured over him like a torrent live to fight another day, abandon the city before the mob tore down the gates. Justinian stood pale shoulders bowed under the weight of collapse. For a moment it seemed as if the empire itself was already lost, the ruler reduced to a frightened man staring at the floor. He glanced once toward the hidden passage that led to the water, an unspoken signal that he was considering surrender to survival. And then Theodora rose. She did not shout. She did not weep. Her voice, trained for the hippodrome, cut through the din like a blade through silk, calm, cold, resonant. She reminded them of what the purple meant. Not dye, not cloth, but destiny. Royal purple makes the noblest shroud, she declared. Better to die as sovereign, she said, than to live as fugitives exiled and begging favours from foreign kings. To flee was to choose infamy. To stay was to claim eternity. Her words froze the chamber. Even Belisarius, the young general, whose restless hands had been tightening on the hilt of his sword, stilled. Mundus, the grizzled commander of the palace guards, narrowed his eyes, reassessing the woman he had once thought a mere ornament. Theodora's certainty was contagious, stiffening spines burning away the fog of panic. She had turned fear into shame and shame into resolve. Justinian's face changed. The hesitation drained, replaced by the grim clarity of command. He no longer looked toward the barges, he barked orders instead. Belisarius and Mundus moved at once, activating the protocols drilled into the palace guard for moments of last defence. Messengers sprinted through hidden passages. Troops were marshalled not to protect the gates, but to encircle the hippodrome itself, where the rioters had gathered in their tens of thousands, drunk on their own fury. In that moment it was clear Justinian might wear the diadem, but Theodora had saved the throne. By reminding him that purple was not a garment but a grave worth dying in, she had turned retreat into slaughter, panic into strategy. The palace trembled with the chants outside, but inside the empire had found its spine again, and it had come unmistakably from the mouth of the Empress. The hippodrome had always been a bowl of stone, a stage for spectacle. On that January night it became a trap. The rioters had poured into its vast oval, believing it their fortress, their place of triumph. They had jeered imperial banners, demanded a new emperor, and shouted Justinian's name with venom. The crowd swelled to tens of thousands, torches lighting their frenzy, their chants rolling like waves against the palace walls. But outside the generals were moving. Belisarius, barely 30 but already a master of battlefield discipline, commanded elite troops hardened by frontier wars. Mundus, scarred veteran of campaigns against barbarian tribes, brought steadiness and ruthlessness in equal measure. Together they executed Justinian's decision with precision. The palace guard and mercenaries sealed the hippodrome's entrances one by one. Heavy gates slammed shut, iron bars dropped into place. What had been an arena became a cage. The psychology of the mob shifted slowly then all at once. At first, the crowd mistook the maneuver for containment, a show of imperial weakness. They laughed, jeered, hurled curses. but as exits closed, the torches flickered with unease, the chanting faltered. The air grew tight with the realization that the bowl they filled was no longer theirs to command. When the troops advanced, they came not with chaotic fury, but with the grim mechanical efficiency of professionals. Shields locked, blades drawn, ranks pressed forward with the inevitability of a tide. The rioters had numbers, but numbers without cohesion. They were artisans, merchants, gamblers, beggars, unarmed or wielding makeshift clubs. Against drilled soldiers, they were as wheat before the scythe. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. Swords rose and fell in rhythm, the sound of steel on flesh and bone, mingling with screams that drowned the hippodrome's familiar roar. The sand once churned by chariot wheels drank deep until it turned to mud dark and glistening under torchlight. By dawn, the chants of Nika had vanished. In their place lay silence broken only by the groans of the dying and the caw of circling crows. 30,000 bodies carpeted the arena floor, a massacre carved into the memory of the city. Historians who came after would count the numbers, weigh the strategies, marvel at the cold logic of Justinian's decision. But for those who stood within the palace that night, one truth was sharper than any statistic power had been secured not by persuasion nor compromise, but by terror. The hippodrome, which had raised Theodora as a child and crowned her as star, had now become her crucible of blood. The moral reckoning cannot be softened. To preserve a throne, 30,000 lives were extinguished in a single night. Theodora's words had given steel to Justinian's resolve, and that steel had cut down his people. Yet within the cold arithmetic of empire, this was survival. The rebellion was ended, the city pacified, the diadem safe. The purple had been defended not with retreat, but with annihilation. Quietly, Constantinople learned the lesson: emperors could bleed, but they could also make the stones themselves drink blood. And from that night forward, no one would ever doubt the Empress's will. In the decades that followed the Nika slaughter, Theodora's power did not retreat into the shadows of palace intrigue. It became woven into the very fabric of the law. Justinian may have been the tireless jurist compiling centuries of decrees into the monumental corpus juris civilis, but Theodora left her signature in statutes that bore not the dryness of codex, but the rawness of memory. She legislated not from scrolls, but from scars. Her first concern was the fate of women who lived the life she had narrowly escaped. She pushed through edicts that forbade the coercion of girls into prostitution, closing the brothels of Constantinople, and forbidding their reopening under imperial threat. Those already trapped in the trade were given the chance unprecedented in Roman law to enter sanctuaries where they might spin wool, earn wages, and live under the protection of the church. For Theodora, each decree was a ghost laid to rest, a law written for the girl who had once danced barefoot for coins and endured the contempt of men in silks. She turned next to mothers. Roman law had long granted fathers absolute power over their households, relegating women to the status of guardians, at best dependents at worst. Theodora's reforms shifted the ground. She secured mothers greater rights over their children, an echo of the desperation she had once witnessed in her own mother's pleas to the Greens, when survival had hinged on a patriarch's whim. With these reforms, she carved protection into the law where once there had only been silence. Sanctuaries rose across the city under her patronage, safe houses, where women fleeing abuse, coercion, or destitution could find refuge. Some were monasteries where the spinning of wool became both livelihood and penance. Others were small communal houses, supported by imperial funds where women could rebuild lives with dignity. They were not perfect shields, no law could fully erase cruelty, but they were a bulwark against a fate Theodora knew too intimately. Her influence did not rival Justinian's grand codification project in scale, yet it complemented it in tone. While he sought order in the abstract, systematizing centuries of decrees aligning empire with logic, she sought mercy in the particular. Together they forged a dual legacy, the iron skeleton of administration paired with veins of compassion. Theodora's edicts did not erase her past, they transmuted it. Each statute was a stone laid over a grave, each clause a whispered vow to the child she had been the mother, who had pleaded in vain, the countless nameless women who had been dismissed, exploited, forgotten. Her reign as co-regent was not only about survival of the empire, but survival of memory, the refusal to let suffering vanish unrecorded. If Justinian's codex made the law eternal, Theodora's reforms ensured it could be human, and that may have been the greater victory. The scars of the Nika riots had not yet faded when Theodora turned her gaze toward the smoking ruins of the city's greatest church. The old basilica of Hagia Sophia, reduced to ash in the uprising, had been the pride of Constantinople. To rebuild it was not simply an act of restoration, it was a statement. From ruin would rise a wonder that no mob could ever again threaten, a monument to divine favour and imperial resolve. Theodora and Justinian poured the treasury into the project. Gold stripped from palaces, revenues siphoned from distant provinces, tributes demanded from governors, all were funneled into stone and mortar. The empire itself became raw material. Marble was quarried from Proconnesus porphyry, from Egypt green, Thessalian stone yellow, Numidian stone, each slab hauled across seas to become part of the great mosaic. From the imperial granaries came not bread but tens of thousands of bricks, so many that chroniclers claimed Constantinople's kilns glowed day and night for months. At the centre of this fevered construction stood two architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians as much as builders. They did not think in walls and roofs, but in geometry and light. The secret of their vision lay in the pendentive, the curved triangle of stone that allowed a circular dome to rest on square foundations. It was a conjuring trick in masonry, turning mathematics into theology. On their drawings, numbers became prayers. Theodora walked among the workers, her presence felt even when unseen. Chroniclers whispered of her firmness with overseers, her refusal to tolerate shortcuts, her insistence that no expense be spared on what would become the empire's crown. She understood what the dome would symbolize, not just imperial might, but survival transfigured. Where rebellion had once toppled a church, now a canopy of gold would rise, daring the world to imagine it could ever fall. Years of labour culminated in a space that defied comprehension. When the scaffolding was finally stripped away, sunlight poured through hidden windows at the dome's base, making the vast canopy appear to float. Gilded tesserae caught the light, turning the ceiling into a sky of molten gold. Stepping inside was like stepping beneath heaven itself. Priests gasped, senators bowed their heads despite themselves, and even hardened soldiers muttered that they had seen the divine. Theodora must have known what they were truly seeing. This was not only devotion, it was survival made visible. The dome did not merely hang from heaven, it hung from will. From the ashes of riot and massacre she and Justinian had conjured, permanence, a structure that declared in stone what their reign had written in blood. The empire could be broken, but it would always rise again. And against the skyline of Constantinople, the golden dome of Hagia Sophia became her silhouette, impossible to ignore, eternal against the shifting sky. By the mid-540s, the woman who had once outshouted mobs and steadied emperors began to falter. Theodora's body betrayed her even as her will remained unbroken. The sources call it a wasting illness. Modern scholars suspect cancer, but whatever its name, it gnawed at her strength with merciless persistence. The Empress, who had once commanded the hippodrome with her voice, now struggled to rise from her couch. Pain became a constant companion, a private humiliation that no crown could shield her from. And yet in public the mask never slipped. She appeared at court with the same serene poise, jewels draped across shoulders that had grown thinner, eyes bright with a fire that illness could not dim. Foreign envoys ushered into the marble halls saw an empress as formidable as ever. Her words measured her presence as heavy as the golden dome that crowned her city. Bishops whispered their complaints, senators plotted their endless intrigues, but no one left her audience doubting that the empire still had two rulers, not one. Within the palace walls, however, the atmosphere thickened. Servants carried rumours like dust in their garments. Was the empress fading? Would Justinian rule alone? Would factions long suppressed stir again? Every cough, every absence from ceremony was noted and dissected. The court as always smelled weakness before it saw it. Theodora knew this. She had built her life on stagecraft, and she understood how quickly performance curdled into parody if cracks showed. So she doubled down on composure. She made decisions from her bedchamber, consulted bishops, drafted edicts, and counselled Justinian with the same steel that had once held him upright during the Nika revolt. Even as her body wasted, her influence endured. But history has a way of punishing women who refuse to vanish quietly. During her lifetime, Theodora was Augusta co-regent lawgiver. After her death, a different portrait emerged. The secret history of Procopius' court, historian turned venomous gossip, painted her as a creature of lust and cruelty, a woman whose power was proof of corruption. To the official record, she was saintly, charitable, pious. To the hidden manuscript, she was monstrous. The truth as ever lies in the tension between memory and malice. What matters is not which version is more accurate, but how easily slander attaches to women who rule. Justinian could order a massacre and be remembered as a lawgiver. Theodora could save the throne with words and be remembered as a whore who schemed her way to power. Reputation she had always known was theatre. Even after death, the performance could be rewritten by others. Theodora bore the cost of being indelible. She did not fade into obscurity as so many empresses had. She became a figure impossible to erase, loved, hated, slandered, sanctified. And in the Byzantine imagination where saints and villains lived side by side, she would remain suspended between the two forever. The end came quietly in 548. No mob at the gates, no purple banners torn from the walls, only the slow suffocation of illness that had stalked her for years. Theodora, who had stared down senators, bishops, and emperors, now faced an enemy that gave no stage to fight upon. She remained in her chambers, the air perfumed with incense and honeyed wine, her body thinned to frailty, but her will intact. She refused to relinquish the purple. Even as her strength ebbed, she ordered that she be dressed in imperial robes, the heavy silk and jewelled mantle lying across her frame like armour. If death must claim her, it would claim an empress. She was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, where generations of emperors lay beneath marble slabs. The chants rose, incense thickened, and the diadem rested once more above her brow in the ritual of farewell, but the weight of her legacy could not be interred. For the barefoot girl who once begged mercy from faction leaders had risen to reshape an empire. She had clawed her way from the hippodrome's dust to the golden dome of Hagia Sophia, from the laughter of courtiers to the terror of generals. She had turned humiliation into law survival, into sanctuary spectacle, into sovereignty. Her story remains dangerous precisely because it is true. Theodora learned the mechanics of power not from tutors or noble birth, but from the gutter, the stage, the faction halls where dignity was traded for bread. She understood that all authority was performance robes, crowns, ceremonies, decrees, and that performance could be seized by anyone willing to master its rhythms. She exposed the thin membrane between theatre and throne, proving that even a woman, marked as untouchable, could rewrite the script if she memorized the cues and refused to look away. That was the lesson gatekeepers most feared, that victims, once they understood the machinery of their own humiliation, could turn it back against their masters. That someone taught to beg might instead command. That the spectacle meant to degrade could be repurposed into a coronation. Centuries later, her figure flickers between extreme saint and schemer harlot and heroine. But the durable truth lies not in those caricatures. It lies in the rule. She embodied power without responsibility, rots, spectacle without compassion, corrodes, and dignity traded for proximity to power is always too high a price. Theodora's thread still runs through the fabric of history, spun from sandust and defiance. She reminds us that every cage, no matter how gilded, has a door, and sometimes the one who seems weakest is the one who learns to open it. The life of Theodora reads less like a linear biography and more like a parable stitched from fragments of survival, ambition, and transformation. Born the daughter of a bearkeeper raised in the chaotic patronage system of the hippodrome discarded on foreign docks, and finally crowned Augusta in the Church of the Holy Apostles, her story is a reminder that power is never simply inherited. It is learned, performed, and often wrestled out of the hands of those who believe it theirs by right. At its heart, Theodora's life reveals how fragile the boundaries between performance and authority really are. The rituals of empire, the diadem, the processions, the purple robes were not truths but symbols, costumes that acquired force because people agreed to treat them as real. Theodora understood this better than most because she had lived on both sides of the divide. As an actress, she learned how emotion could be a currency, how timing could move a crowd, how a tear or a silence could weigh more than a coin. As an empress, she turned those same lessons into governance, persuading senators, emboldening Justinian, and rewriting law. Her rise is a testament to the unsettling but empowering fact: if authority is a performance, then the script is never beyond revision. Her reforms, especially those shielding women from forced prostitution or granting mothers greater rights, were not abstract acts of policy. They were rooted in memory. Each statute was a ghost laid to rest, a quiet attempt to give others the choices she had been denied. Here lies one of the most valuable lessons for us today. The wounds we carry can become either chains that bind us or tools that build something better. Suffering does not automatically ennoble, but when transmuted into empathy and action, it can alter the lives of countless others. And yet Theodora's story also carries a darker reminder. The same will that gave her the courage to stand during the Nika revolt also helped unleash a massacre of 30,000. Strength and ruthlessness often travel together, and history rarely permits its heroes to be pure. The question is not whether power corrupts, but whether those who wield it remember that every decision leaves traces in human lives, not just on parchment or in stone. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Theodora's thread through history is this: recognize the mechanisms around you. Whether it is in politics, workplace hierarchies, or social circles, much of what appears inevitable is only performance roles. People play scripts repeated because no one dares interrupt. Theodora interrupted. She named the purple not as luxury, but as shroud. She saw the law not as sacred, but as malleable. And she refused to bow to the gatekeepers who insisted she remain in the role they assigned her. In life, we will all encounter invitations to trade dignity for proximity, to accept cages, because they are gilded. Theodora's story whispers across centuries: decline them. See the stage for what it is, understand the script, and when necessary, write your own. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.